me neither. I was like, I had to turn on some kind of notification or turn on some kind of access. Bailey wants to say hi. We're wearing matching pajamas today.
You two are adorable.
They were our Halloween costumes last year, so I'm kind of cheating.
That's like, God, you guys are so cute.
Say hi. I know we have hearts, yeah.
You're so cute. How are you?
Say hi.
Hi.
Her name's Bailey.
Hi, Bailey. Oh, she's so cute.
It's past her bedtime, so she's like, I'm gonna stay up so I can like see what you're doing.
Oh yeah, and
I'm like, okay.
Mom is distracted. It's like
game time. Oh yeah, for sure. So yeah.
Well, introduce yourself to everyone and let everybody know where you're from, and then we'll go from there.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. My name is Crystal Bulk. I am from Florida. Actually, I was born in Georgia, but lived in Naples, Florida, pretty much my entire life. We bought a house in Lehigh, which is like 40 minutes north of there, about, I guess it's 10 years ago now. So we live up here, but we still do almost everything in Naples because our families are both there.
Okay.
So yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Let's see who's on here. Hey, Elise. Hi, Jordan. People are all saying hi.
Hi.
So I guess just tell people, I was telling people before I got you on here how you've been like a ridiculous beast when it comes to raising BWS awareness and fun.
Oh, good.
I'm like so
How do I not hear what she's saying?
Oh, thank you.
I hear what she's saying.
Yeah, so I'm a Christian. I have a really strong faith. I feel like that's a lot of the reason why I'm able to kind of talk and get through some of the things we've faced. Especially when my daughter was born, it kind of seemed like we were just bombarded time after time. Every doctor appointment, literally, for the first, I would say, 8 months, they identified another problem. It was like every doctor we took her to was like, oh, there's also this. Oh, and this is going on. Oh, and it was like, I just got to the point where I was like, make it stop. Is anybody going to tell me that my kid is normal and that it's going to be okay? And then after, like, I got to this point where I kind of felt like I was in a cocoon, and like I just felt like really alone, like just surrounded by complete darkness. And I realized, that it's in those times typically that you feel like you're alone. And my faith, has really helped me through that, because, I realized that those are the times that God's working on you and helping strengthen you for the times that are coming ahead. So for me, we looked at those times and we're like, okay, what can we do to make sure that when somebody else is in this time in their life, that they know that they're not alone? Like, what can we do? And I reached out to Alex's Lemonade Stand because I had saw them, I think it was on Facebook, I'm not really sure where. I had saw their company, and I saw that they were doing a 1,000,000 Mile movement. And I was like, that's pretty cool. That's a cool way to raise funds, something different, something refreshing. You're not just like randomly asking people for money. You're actually doing something to ask people for money. So I was like, what could I do? Like, how could I set myself apart? And I reached out to them, and they were like, well, you should host a lemonade stand. I'm like, what? I'm not hosting a lemonade stand. Like, you are crazy. I was just like, how am I going to do that? I'm like, how am I going to do that? So I did our first lemonade stand. I reached out to another mom. Actually, she reached out to me on Facebook because of the Beckwith page. And she and I worked together, and we did our first event, our first lemonade stand. It was in April for the Awareness Day.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, it was really cool because she actually lived somewhere else. I want to say Louisiana. I could be wrong. And she was looking to relocate in the area, and she's asking me about the doctors that we see and who we like and about therapy, all these questions. And it was cool because I felt like we really started developing a pretty cool bond. And when she moved here, it was she immediately started knowing who the providers were and who she could link up to. So that was really neat because I had never met anybody else with Beckwith. And so no other kids, no other families. And I have Beckwith. I didn't know that I had it.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah. I was diagnosed after my daughter was born. So that's the weirdest part about our journey.
Did you tell me that before?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
It was okay. So the weirdest thing for me was Yeah, like I had a lot of really what seemed like random medical issues growing up, and they were all like kind of insignificant, nothing super crazy. Probably the biggest thing is my mouth. I've had, let's see, 4 baby teeth removed when I was little. I have 6 adult teeth missing, and all 4 of my wisdom teeth. And when I smile, you literally see every single one of my teeth. There is no tooth in my mouth that you don't see. All of them are right there. Yeah. That's all I got. Yeah. It's pretty funny. And then when I was pregnant with my older daughter, the one that you just saw, I actually started developing more bone in this side of my jaw, which is my hemi side. So this whole side started to grow out to the point where I had to have surgery on it while I was pregnant. Oh, really? To have it shaved down. They took an entire cubed inch out of my jawline to make it look back to normal. But I've always been a little bit asymmetrical. My right side's a little bit bigger. Everything on my entire right side is bigger. Like my hand, my foot, everything. My foot is probably the most dramatic. My foot is, I would say like the left is probably like a 10 and the right is like a solid 11 plus. So it's a huge difference. A lot of people don't notice it until I point it out, and then they're like, oh yeah, I do see that. And what's interesting is when my daughter was diagnosed, they wanted to do testing on both of us so they could learn like what type of Beckwith she had. So they wanted to learn more. And when it came back, the results, they were like, oh, well, you have Beckwith. And I was kind of like, what? That's not right. And then once I started like really, really diving into it and learning about it, I was like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Like it started like everything that I had experienced. I've had, oh my gosh, what are those called? Kidney stones. I've had kidney stones twice. My right kidney is enlarged. So, I mean, it all made sense. It just like all started clicking. I'm like, why do I have this, you know? And so everything just started to kind of click. When I was little, I remember I was always way bigger than all my classmates, like almost a foot taller than all my classmates. I'm like 5'8.5", 5'9" now. So I'm not that tall, but like I guess for a female, that's like definitely above average. Yeah. And I like to wear heels too, so I always feel like really tall. But my husband's really tall, so I kind of need to. It's like one of those things. So yeah, but growing up, I was always on the very back riser of like every performance that we did. And I remember, you know, like being made fun of because my legs actually grew faster than the rest of my body. Not significantly, but enough where kids would be like, oh, her legs are so long. And I always, unknowingly, I always like bent my right leg when I was growing up. I always bent it, like every photo looking back. And yeah, I would always do that. And then people would go, oh, she looks like a flamingo, those long legs. And she was bending. So there's things that happened that I never clicked. And then once I got like diagnosed, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
I don't know how I missed that.
Yeah. So one of the things, like, I guess the biggest reason that I wanted to talk was because, you know, not only was mine missed, my Beckwith was missed. Even though I had very subtle things going on, I also did have a complete right side hemi that even when I brought it up to people, like I remember telling my aunt and uncle one time and my grandparents on a different occasion, I was like, why is my right leg so much bigger? Or like, why is my right hand bigger? And I would put them side by side and be like, hey, why is this different? And I remember like my family being like, well, everybody has a difference, so that's no big deal. So I was like, oh, okay. And I remember just kind of like being like, okay, but I don't know anyone else has this big of a difference. But, and I would just kind of like brush it off, you know, until like, you know, I remember when I would run specifically, like it would really agitate my leg. My leg would swell. My right leg would just retain fluid and just swell, and I would never want to run. And all my friends would be like, oh, I love running in grade school, middle school, high school. And I was like, I hate running. I don't know how anybody does that. That is not fun. And yeah, so it's like, you know, well, maybe you just need a shoe lift to make a difference.
So did your mom never notice the Hemi when you were a kid?
So that's the thing. I was actually raised by my aunt and uncle.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry.
That's okay.
I was actually raised by my aunt and uncle, and after the age of like 14, my mom passed away, so I just had my dad. So I think that was part of it that was kind of hard too. Like looking back in retrospect, I really didn't have a lot of people to ask questions to. My dad's memory is awful because he was like in the military and he was injured. So I didn't really have him to be like, hey, like, do you remember anything about my childhood that would like kind of make all this make sense?
Right.
And then my mom wasn't there to ask either. So like it kind of just was me like remembering things that happened and being like, oh, okay.
Wow.
Like that makes so much more sense now. Just like I can't even think of other examples right now, but I'm sure there are more.
Yeah,
but,
definitely.
yeah. So that was the biggest thing. When my daughter, like my hardest thing to overcome was actually when my daughter was diagnosed. Like it took so long. Like it was like she was born, and the day she was born, right away we heard, you know, she has low tone. We didn't even know what that meant. We heard, she, something, her tongue is like not staying in her mouth. Like she's hypoglycemic. Like they were like kind of throwing all these words around like they were all like no big deal. Right. And later on I found out, that they kind of are, but like the way they were like talking about them was kind of like, oh, this is going on. Like, oh, this is going on. And it wasn't until like the day we left the hospital that one of the nurses came in, and then she was talking to another nurse. She wasn't even talking to me. And she kind of looked at the other nurse and she goes, yeah, her tongue like won't stay in her mouth. And she says it like real quiet, like, oh, her tongue won't stay in her mouth. And she goes, she probably has beckwith.
Really?
And yeah, and she said it really low, and I was like, what? Like, what is she talking about? And right around that time, my friend had actually texted me and was like, hey, like, it's okay if she has a big tongue. Like, that's not a big deal. Like, my friend's daughter has beckwith. And I was like, what? And I didn't know she had spelled it out. And that was the first time I'd ever seen it like in writing. And I was like, is that even how you spell that? And I was like, that's weird. And I was like, whatever. And she acted like it was no big deal. So I was like, okay. I was kind of like out of sight, out of mind. I'm like, okay, whatever. It's probably just not even related. And then like the doctor comes in and he's like, oh, if she doesn't get back to her, like he wanted her to be at exactly 1 pound or less than what she was when she was born. And she had lost like over an entire pound at the hospital in 5 days. So they were like, this is not good. Like if we can't get her back up to under a pound lost, then you can't go home. Mind you, they told me this after I had already signed my release for myself. And this was the first time they had mentioned anything about possibly keeping her, anything about the significance of her health problems. Like that was the first time they had mentioned any of it to us. Right. Everything was always kind of like, oh, like this is going on, but they would never give us more information. It was always like, I guess they were waiting for someone else to tell us. Mm-hmm. It seemed like they were all passing the buck is what it felt like. In retrospect. And then the doctor came in. My husband was with me all 5 days, the entire time we were at the hospital. He literally went home to drop off some of our stuff and walk our dog because the one person who told us they would walk the dog couldn't come that morning. Aww. So during that time is when the doctor decided to come in and tell me about everything. So it was my first time I was literally by myself for the very first time, and I just remember being like, what is going on? Like, I just remember being like so overwhelmed, and I didn't even know, like it didn't even register like what all they were saying. They didn't give me any paperwork, nothing to explain anything. And they were like, well, you have to come back tomorrow anyway so that we can check her jaundice levels. You're going to have to come back all week. So, we'll provide more information. And then they never did. It was like they just let us fall through the cracks, and they were like, well, you can follow up with your primary doctor. And so, yeah, it was pretty awful. So I get to her first primary doctor visit, and the doctor was like, she took one look at her and she's like, yeah, she's severely dehydrated. She's like, you need to feed her right now. And she like turned around in a cabinet, opened up the cabinet literally right in front of me, took out formula, shook it up, pulled the nipple off, and was like, feed her. Like, just like, and she goes, if you don't feed her this, she goes, you're going to be going to the ER. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, I had no idea. I just remember being like, oh, okay, I just fed her before I got here. But I just remember being like really freaked out by that. But I was telling her, like, I was really struggling with breastfeeding, like really bad, because I think now in retrospect, because of the macroglossia and the hypoglycemia, like the combination, I think she had low tone in her face. So even though her latch was good, she would get really tired, and then she would like kind of fall asleep. She would work so hard, and then she'd be like out. And because she didn't get enough, it wasn't even 15 minutes between feedings, and she would wake up screaming like this like shrill scream, like, I didn't get enough food, like I'm starving. And I just remember being like, this isn't normal. And I kept saying, like, this is not normal. And I kept, like, you know, how every parent does. I kept comparing her to my other daughter. And I kept saying, my other daughter did this. Like, this is not normal. And they were like, oh, every kid's different. It's all different. I'm like, no, this is not normal. Like, I need a lactation specialist. So they brought me the lactation specialist. And the lady literally worked with me for 45 minutes to feed my kid one time.
Oh my God.
To get enough food to feed her one time.
That is so stressful.
Yeah, and she was like, oh, you need to like, Bailey, stop. She's like, oh, you need to like move this blanket over here and then roll this towel. She literally had me take like 7 towels, 3 like washcloths, just to like hold her body in a position where she could nurse, and because of her low tone. And I was like, I can't do this every like 2 hours. There's just no way. Like, this is not going to work. This is not feasible at all. Like, there's no way that they could actually expect someone to do this. And I brought that up to my doctor when we went there. I was like, yeah, they were like telling me like, this is what I have to do, and like reposition her and all this stuff. And she was like, no, that's crazy. She's like, a fed baby is more important than you just saying like, oh, I'm going to work as hard as I can to make this happen. She's like, you just need to feed her. And I was like, okay. But I just remember I was super stressed about that. And it was like, I'm sure it didn't help. Like, you know, they say like stress like affects your breastfeeding and stuff. So I'm sure that was part of it too. Like just the overall combination of everything. And yeah, so for me, it was like there were so many things that they'd kind of just brushed under the table. And I was like, I don't understand how there was all of these signs. Like, literally, I remember looking it up. The first time I actually looked up Beckwith, I was in the car, and I was reading, like, the top 8 things that showed up. And just based on the hospital visit, I could tell my daughter already had, like, 6 out of the top 8. And then I kept reading, and it was like 8 out of the top 10. And then I kept reading, and I was like, I'm going to stop there. Like, no. But I just remember thinking for a while there, they told us at first, they were like, oh, she doesn't have it. They did 2 different tests, a macroarray and 2 other things. I can't remember which one came back first. The duplication one, the methylation duplication thing came back first, and they were like, oh, she doesn't have that. It came back negative. So she probably doesn't have Beckwith. And I was like, oh, thank God. And then I was like, wait, well, then what did she have? Because if she has all these symptoms, everything is aligned, then what is it? Like, it just didn't make sense. That and the actual like process of getting her blood was like such an ordeal. Like, her veins kept rolling and collapsing. It took us like probably, I think, 3 months worth of going to the doctor every other week to try to attempt to get the blood before they finally got enough to get all of the testing done. And that was just like, I was like paranoid, panicked, like, how long is this going to take? And they were like, if it doesn't work this time, they were telling me like, oh, if it doesn't work this time, then we're going to have to go ahead and send someone to your house to do it. And I was like, well, I'm going to the pediatric ward at the hospital. Like, I'm doing it where they do like NICU babies. Like, there's no other place that I know of that was going to do it better. You think you have somebody that does it better? Like, I remember being like, there's no way. So then it finally came back. And I guess the reason it came back negative with the one with the duplications is because she doesn't have a missing or a duplicated chromosome. She has a damaged chromosome. and it's a maternal, like it's CDKN1C. It's the maternal, like it's hereditary. So like I have it and I passed it to her. And then they were like, oh, 50% chances of you passing it every pregnancy. And yeah, that to me was just like, at first it was a shock, and then it was like, okay, so I guess we're not having more kids, just because of the stress of it. And then like the longer things started going on, the more I kind of felt like, oh, honey, okay, baby. The more I was like, here, hold on, sorry, I gotta pick her up. She's crying.
No, that's fine.
She's upset. Hi, baby.
Hi. Oh, she's
Hi.
so cute. Hi.
Hi.
She's like, who the heck are you? Hi. What you doing? What are you doing?
Oh, there she said hi now.
There we go. You're so cute.
How can you hear the lady say?
I see you.
I want to hear it too, saying.
Baby, it's in my ear. You can't hear it because it's in my ear. I had to adjust that. So, sorry, I totally lost my train of thought.
That's okay. You were saying that you found out that it's the maternal gene, and you guys were kind of processing like whether to have kids or more kids and stuff like that.
Yeah, and so then as like time went on, I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, I have Beckwith, and like I feel like I'm pretty normal. Like if my parents knew that I had it, would they like, or like if one of my older brothers had it or something, would they have stopped having kids? Like, I mean, I don't know. It kind of made me feel like, okay, maybe I'm looking at this all wrong. Mm-hmm. So I kind of just started trying to think of it more of like, again, like back to my faith and like, okay, like, if another kid happens to have it, like if we do have another kid and it happens to have it, like, that's part of God's plan for that child. And, like that's part of his plan for our family. And so, yeah.
Right.
So I just kind of like tried to see it from like a totally different viewpoint instead of such a negative, like, I think it's funny how negative we can be in our own heads sometimes, like our own like self-talk. Yes. And I try so hard to like work on that. But yeah, I was like, okay, so I was changing that. But yeah, Alex's Lemonade Stand, I got involved with them. They're like such a great company, like dollar for dollar. Like I looked at their financials and what they spend their money on and how they, like how much money you donate actually goes back to the company and what the difference is, where that money goes. And they're just such an amazing organization. And they're also one of the only companies that I know of that will let you like allocate where you want your research funds to go. And for me, that was a really big deal because like having Beckwith, and having a child with Beckwith and seeing all these kids on the Facebook site, like your kids, and like, everybody else's, you think about the what ifs and what could happen. And that there's more research needed.
Definitely.
The number one thing to me is like, okay, but we weren't even diagnosed at the hospital. We weren't even diagnosed at the hospital.
Yeah.
I was never diagnosed until I was like 33. So, yeah. And I'm like, I mean, I don't know, man. It's, to me, it's absolutely crazy.
When was she officially diagnosed?
So she was born in June, and her diagnosis came in October. So it took only 4 months, but they started doing like blood work for testing almost immediately. I mean, we were home for probably a month before they were like, oh, let's start doing testing. I mean, it was really quick, but it's mostly because I had this really great neurologist. We took her to the neurologist because she had like a couple of things that I was told weren't related to Beckwith that were going on with her. The biggest thing was her right side, like her entire right side was stronger than her left. So what you would see